do today is much, I mean, it won't go into the nitty-gritty of the academics yet. I think that's for later in the conference. It's just to maybe give you some structures to think about this. So first of all, if we look at generally at how people come to respond to rules and whether and under which conditions people come to break them, we can see that there is always a combination of motivation and situation. And we tend to talk about this mostly from motivation and mostly from extrinsic motivation and mostly from incentives, which was already mentioned. Of course, we can also say a lot about intrinsic motivations. So for people like Stapel, we can talk about their morality. We can talk about sort of personal integrity. And there's a lot of research showing that people themselves think themselves are much more ethical than they actually behave. They're very bad at predicting their own ethical behavior. And also when they look back at their behavior, they may overview it. And there's all kinds of personality traits we can look at, and there's all kinds of social influences, again, in the intrinsic motivations. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. What is less discussed is people's ability to follow rules. For instance, whether they know the rules. If I just give one example, the Dutch University Integrity Standards is 66 standards. I don't know a single person who knows them. And I'm in charge of implementing them. Not even I know them, even after having studied them. I mean, we're not good at remembering more than seven aspects. And that's saying just these general rules. If we implement them, we often make many more rules. That's one of the problems. Once we see an incident, we create more rules, which may actually make it harder for us to follow them. Also, we may not be practically able to do as rules want us to do, because we may lack technical capacities, methodological capacities, time, and I'll get back to that. But another important element is we may have a lot of opportunities to break rules, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. So this is just an outline which may help you to sort of situate things. What I'll do today is to go into the organizational aspect of this, so to move beyond the individual. And what I did, my research is about what one could call toxic organizational culture. I've tried to understand why do some of the organizations, and some are mentioned here, Siemens, for instance, for those of you in Germany may recall that Siemens was found as one of the biggest bribe payers ever. Since then, they have become the second biggest case because we have a really big case in Brazil, the Petrobras case. Enron, we remember, police violence in the US, Boeing, for instance, Save the Children. I've studied Volkswagen. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Wells Fargo, big American bank, as well as BP, the big British oil company. There's many others. What we see in these cases is we don't just see individual misconduct at one time in place. We see structural misconduct with an organization over a longer period of time involving more individuals. And that's what really interests me. So from these worst cases, so to speak, I try and draw out sort of what makes these organizations more prone, it seems, to have this sort of a negative conduct. So in this, I try and look at what we can call organizational culture. And in organizational studies and management science, this has been operationalized most influentially by Albert Schein. We can look at three different levels. We can look at the structures already mentioned, hierarchy, incentives. Then we're really at sort of the visible external layer. You can study structures without going into an organization. The rules as well. But if we go deeper, and this is where it gets harder, where also deeper sorts of negative values set in and are harder to change, we get to the values. The ones that we can see and read are the explicit ones, but we can also get those that people think of what others think they should do, the so-called injunctive social norms, and the deepest ones, which are sort of hidden assumptions. You don't think about it anymore. This is what is expected of you. So if we, for instance, look at publication norms, we see over the last years with the DORA declaration that, and also with how some of the funders have changed the way we should look at academic research. It shouldn't matter where you publish or what your H value is. That doesn't mean that the hidden assumptions of individual researchers are still based on where others publish, how much they publish, or also how often they're cited. Even when we change the formal structures, the values don't change as easily. We still judge those. And we do that also unconsciously. I've seen myself do it time and again when I read resumes. I still automatically jump to which journal, how much, etc., even if I don't want to. And then we go to the practices, which is also at a deeper level. It's not what we think we should do, but what we actually do, what we see others doing, but also what we're no longer aware of seeing others doing. And at the deepest level, what a certain situation elicits from us, what we think is normal. We can apply that to analyze cases of organizational failure. And I've done that most deeply in these 3 organizations that I just mentioned earlier. And I won't go into details of the organization. If you're interested, I have an open access paper called Toxic Corporate Culture. And you can look it up. It was published in Administrative Sciences. What I'll do today is sort of loosely translate this without having done the actual research. So don't see this as an academic presentation, because that wouldn't have proper integrity. See it more as an inspiration of where we want to go. And if you're interested in this project, we're doing a much larger study at the University of Amsterdam, together with Leiden and Rotterdam, where we're building a large database of negative cases, including also universities, including my own university, which I think is a perfect case. Like many others, I'm not saying it's extra bad, but we've had a number of incidents that make me interested in understanding more. So basically what I start with any of these case studies is I start with the goals and strategies. I want to understand, what is an organization here for? What is it saying about itself? What is it trying to achieve? And if you look at these 3 organizations that I studied, they all wanted to be the top. Sound familiar, right? Most universities want to be the top. I remember at some point in the University of Leiden, where I used to study and teach, that our dean said, I don't want to hear the word excellence anymore until we're good enough. But we're still using the word excellence. My former dean in my law school now, he said, as an April Fool's joke, he sent out a memo to the whole law school, our new research program is being excellent in excellence. And it took a while before people actually got the joke, because we're so accustomed, and this is culture, to no longer seeing that the word excellence is ridiculous. What happened in Wells Fargo, Volkswagen, and BP is that they set targets that were unattainable. So Volkswagen, for instance, wanted to become the biggest car sales company, going for clean diesel technology to crack the US market, but doing so in cars that didn't have the space in them to actually have sufficient space to have a big enough ureum tank, so that you didn't need to refill ureum before a normal servicing appointment. And when that happened in the US market, the only way they found that they could still sell cars, because nobody wanted to buy a car, whereas an owner you would have to refill 2 tanks, they came up with this strategy to cheat on the emissions. Wells Fargo went even further. They set a target for every bank employee to sell 8 products for every client. So just think you're a bank employee. Somebody comes into your bank, they want to open a bank account. That's one product. Okay, you've done 1, that's good. Maybe you get them a credit card, that's 2 products. Maybe you get them a home insurance, that's 3 products. You have to get to 8. So you see in these companies, they set very high targets. We do the same in universities. I already mentioned excellence in research and teaching. We also see that we set targets in order to be promoted. For instance, I know in economics, most economic schools in the world, in order to be promoted, you have to publish in maybe a list of 20 journals. I think some economists could probably calculate how many slots there are in journals, and how many people there are that want to get tenure, and how many slots they need. Then you can see it's impossible to actually fulfill the amount of slots that these people need to actually publish. So we have unrealistic targets, in both soft targets and hard targets. What that means is we get a very strong pressure then to meet these targets. If you look at insights from criminology, and this is the study that looks at deviant behavior, they use the so-called term strain. And strain means when you as an individual, but it can also happen in an organization, are unable to fulfill your dreams, your ambitions, and your targets. And when that happens, you get negative emotions. In order to cope with those, you're more likely to engage in deviant or rule-breaking behavior. That's exactly what we see. What I'm saying here is sort of a natural truth, was already mentioned in the introduction. We don't even need to study this. But what we see in these organizations is that this becomes normalized in an organization and seen as normal. I think we've all been part of this. We've all been part of that. We are under unrealistic targets, unrealistic expectations, unrealistic workload. And part of that isn't just the workload and the targets on our primary objectives. I think the secondary objectives, and I think there we have a difference with Europe and the US. I just came back from teaching in the US for 5 years. I see our secondary sort of obligations in terms of the amount of training we do, the amount of bureaucracy we have around teaching, the amount of bureaucracy we have around research, the obligations to generate research funding, etc. All of these create more of a workload that makes all of this unattainable. And we've seen that this moves from the incentives, where we see them clearly, to the values and practice. The hard thing is take away the incentives, as we've tried to do, for instance, with the publication standards. That doesn't mean you're going to change how people actually look at work of others. Here I want to mention a specific challenge that we have in academia, compared, for instance, to a bank. In a bank, it's quite easy to define quality. That quality is the bottom line, it's income, it's profit, and it's measurable. Our core issue is that our quality is not something we can easily measure. And once we make it measurable, it becomes it becomes an output rather than an outcome or an impact. So it becomes something, for instance, like the number of publications or the types of journals that you're in, or the amount of money that you've generated in a grant, which isn't a real understanding of quality. And that means also that we are in a situation where those who get to define what the measurement is of quality also get to exercise power over those that don't get to define it, which creates also more stress in an organization. Next question for me in these case studies, and I would say the same in university, is, and I think is, why don't people speak against or out against unrealistic targets? What happens when people speak out? And what we see in these organizations that I studied, there was very limited internal communication. It was obstructed at many different levels. And these were very different organizations. So Volkswagen is a very centralized organization. Some have called it sort of the North Korea of North Rhine-Westphalen. I think it's located. And we see BP, for instance, they were very decentralized because they wanted to make sure that all the problems were at the local level and not at the central level. But it created the same problem. There was no successful flow of information going upwards or downwards. There was also frequent fear. People were they didn't have job security. They could easily lose their jobs. And also there was a frequent turnaround, especially at the lower levels in the organization. And I think we can see similarities there in university. First of all, we have a whole range of lower level actors who are very insecure in their jobs. PhD students, postdocs especially, but also increasingly there's adjunct professors and all kinds of non-permanent contracts. These people, for them to speak out is extra difficult. And second, when you're new, you're sort of not yet in a position where you feel that you can speak out. So because we get all these new people coming in, people who are here with us longer, they are in a certain hierarchy. And of course, depending on your organization, this may be of influence. What's important here is to think about the difference between formal and social hierarchies. So the formal hierarchy is, okay, there's a professor and there's an assistant professor, and the professor exercises hierarchy over the assistant professor. But what is equally important is the social hierarchy, which can build up because there may be certain people that are bullies, even though they're not at the top, that may actually intimidate others, that may also gossip about others. One of my core insights comes from a colleague of mine, Gary Gray, who spent about a year working in a factory in Canada, and he was studying near misses. So he was studying, actually, he nearly got his head chopped off twice. And he was looking at why don't people speak out against these unsafe working conditions. And he found it wasn't so much the formal hierarchy, but really the social hierarchies that played a really big role. So in order to understand that, you have to go much deeper into an organization. So even if you're going to flatten the organization, as for instance is the case in the US, where you don't have the same type of hierarchies that we have in the Netherlands or in Germany, you may still have certain professors, even though everybody is a full professor at some point, who don't dare to speak out because of other professors. What we see here is you may normalize, create a social norm that you don't speak out. It becomes normal that actually you say, okay, these are not things that we can speak about. If I can give one example, I was at some point working in an academic institution where after a major scandal, my colleagues came to me and they said, look, there's much more happening, but we're not going to talk about it because you guys, meaning me and management, are not going to do anything about it anyway. And that's a very frustrating thing, even for people in a higher hierarchy. They may not be able to know what's going on because people are not going to tell them if they don't trust them. What happens because of this is there becomes opportunities for rule breaking because people are not speaking out about it. So you get this space in which things can be done. When you study cases like Stapel's, these really, really egregious cases, you have to ask, why didn't the PhD students speak out? Why didn't the postdocs speak out? And clearly we can see some of the same issues. It also creates more stress and also more abuse of power because, as you're not speaking out, you're going to feel less empowered. You're going to feel more negative about yourself. And you're going to feel also that there's nothing you can do about it, which only makes it worse and worse. Then the next question we had is, okay, what happens when people start breaking the rules? What happens if you have a singular case, let's say, of people cutting corners? And it's quite interesting. Unfortunately, Stapel's book, he wrote a book after he was found to have blatantly doctored his data. I don't know if you know the Stapel case, but Stapel was a very successful social psychology professor who just fabricated data. But in his book, he describes very nicely the sort of inflection point in his career where he started to do this. And he says that for years, as he started as a professional in his PhD and postdoc, he saw that colleagues were doing all kind of gray area stuff, not including certain data, doing extra analyses to get a better p-value, maybe exclude another bit of data. And all of that, which may be gray area, may even be in violation, isn't as bad as fabricating data. And then he was doing that for years. It had normalized. And then at some point he says he just changed a digit in his spreadsheet and suddenly he had a good p-value. And of course, that's very extreme. That's anti-science. It's nothing to do with science. But what he shows, and whatever we think of him writing a book and publishing it and people like me buying it after he did all this, it still shows, at least as a story, that there is a wide sort of practices that occur before we get to the really bad stuff. And those practices become normalized. So criminologists, what they say is there is a sort of normalization of deviancy because we have limited responses to rule breakers and we start to think that breaking rules becomes normal. So if you put a new person in, they'll be like, what's happening here? But people who have been there longer, they gradually grow accustomed to how we do things. And it's very hard to get out of that. What also happens in case of rule breaking is often that organizations, they don't really look at themselves as an organization. What they do is they shift blame on the individual. They say, oh, this was a really bad scholar, but we're okay. This happened in all three organizations that I studied. I always think back on the Tour de France with this. Every 10 years or so, we get a major case. I remember when Lance Armstrong was coming up in the Tour de France and speed cycling, everybody said, oh, but now it's all clean because we had all the riders before and it was really dirty, but now it's okay. Then after the whole Lance Armstrong case, then we said, but now it's really clean. So we try and sort of say it's the individual. We've had the same with Stapel. After that, in psychology, we said, now we've learned our lesson. But what we haven't done enough, at least at the organizational level, what I've seen in organizations I've worked at, is to kind of say, okay, where have we gone wrong? Why didn't people speak out? Where have leadership failed? Where have complaints mechanisms failed? What is beyond these sort of visible mechanisms? What's wrong in the power structure? What's wrong in the values? Part of this is that we also have limited internal discussion on what went wrong. And a major problem here is the problem of privacy. I sometimes feel that we've overvalued privacy while sacrificing transparency. I've been involved as a witness in a major case of academic misconduct about which I'm not allowed to talk, even though the person involved, and this was not at my university, was found guilty. That person involved was forced to have some minor disciplinary action, even though it was gross academic misconduct, but even the victims, and there were victims, were not allowed to write about it, even though it involved plagiarism. They were not allowed to do anything, even when they were unhappy with the action that the university took, all because of privacy. And that's a very interesting thing. Very often it is mentioned as the privacy of the witnesses and the victims, but very often it actually includes the privacy of the perpetrator. And I think there's a real balance here that we have to strike between privacy, which is an interest, but also between the ability of organizations to learn from mistakes. I think in order to do that, you need to have transparency. So going back to that case I mentioned earlier, where some of my colleagues expressed to me, we won't talk about what else is going on. They did that in part because the response that our leadership, including me, took when there was a case of misconduct at one of the organizations I used to work. In that case, there was no open discussion of this. Why not? Because of labor reasons, we didn't want to get into a labor conflict with the person that was engaging in the bad behavior. And that's one of the things I see in universities compared to corporations. They're not really brave to take these cases in the end to court. They, in the end, are so afraid of a major conflict that they sort of try and deal with these things in a way that everybody leaves sort of out of it. And I'm not saying that conflict is always good, but because of that, they overvalue, I think, the privacy, and they don't really learn from it. The other part of, so that also has to do with managing liability. And we see this also in the corporations. They're really focused on managing liability, making sure that we're not liable. But what happens because of that is that you're actually defending against the behavior. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. At worst, I don't have examples from that from academia, but I do have from corporations. They end up condoning rule breaking. So for instance, BP, after the major spill in the Gulf, they said, look, it's only a couple of thousand barrels, even though they knew it was going to be much more. It was millions. And after they found out it was millions, they said, well, still compared to the size of the ocean, that's really small. So they deny harm. Volkswagen went a step further. You may be aware, because many of you are from Germany, that they actually did tests after all of this was found out. They did tests with monkeys that were actually breathing in gases from clean diesel to show that clean diesel was less bad than a Ford F-150 pickup truck, which it wasn't, by the way. So we're trying actually to show that what they did wasn't that bad. And this is a thing you can look for. I will talk about it a little bit in the next thing. So what we get here is we get once we see others breaking rules, we're normalizing, it's called descriptive negative social norm, negative behavior. What we see others do, we are more likely to do. Tons of research on this. We're normalizing deviancy. And because of that, it also becomes harder to actually pick it up. And that also creates more opportunity. If more people are breaking rules, it's also harder to find out about it because you have only limited ways of looking into issues. And here it gets really interesting at the next stage. I asked, what happens when the wrongdoing and violations become public? This is the worst cases. And one of the things I saw in these cases, and I've seen the same in academia, is some of the things I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about sort of these internal, when it's still internal rule breaking, they become worse. We see more blame shifting. We see more reputation management and liability management. And what happens then is what criminologists call neutralization. So neutralization theory says that, look, people, how are they able to break rules even though they know it's wrong? They say, well, it's because they're able to neutralize the shame and guilt they may feel ahead of time or afterwards. And they can do that in all kinds of ways, but one of the ways is to deny injury, harm, or responsibility, or even to blame some of the victims. And I see similar things happening in the corporate world, but I think in academia, we can also look at that. Where have there been instances in scandals where we actually see that there have been denials of the type of harm, where there have been very defensive strategies? I don't have examples straight away, but I think it's an important aspect. I do know that there's always blame shifting. So we see deeper here that we focus on the individual rather than on the organization. We sort of want to want to push the individual out and say, look, that was a bad apple, but it wasn't a bad barrel or even a bad sort of orchid. What I've seen in the worst cases, and I have no indication of this in academia, is I've been obstructing external investigations. So Volkswagen is probably the best case to point, where Volkswagen, they very early on found out that they were going to be caught. There was a postdoc from the University of North Carolina doing a presentation in San Diego, and that postdoc had done a really cool study. He put a emissions monitoring equipment inside a Volkswagen. And while driving, they measured the emissions from the car. And they were like, wow, it's so different from the lab. How cool. So they just presented that, not even accusing Volkswagen. And Volkswagen was in the room, and they already said, there's internal memos, wow, we're going to get caught. They spent a whole year leading sort of the California investigations about this. I mean, in a different direction. They said, no, the postdoc didn't know what they were doing. Their research was faulty, et cetera, et cetera. And even when they had evidence that at some point they said, oh, we're going to address this. And now we're going to do a recall of all the cars, and we're going to take out the software. You know what they actually did? They installed more effective cheating software. I'm not saying that universities do this. All I'm saying is maybe we need to look at this at the worst cases. Okay, I come to my final point now. So this is sort of what happens. I already mentioned this. Final point is mixed messages. And this is a very, very harmful thing that happens here. What happens in all these cases I studied, and I see the same thing in universities, none of these companies says at the tone at the top, the leadership say, well, let's cheat on emissions. That's a good thing. Let's create unsafe working conditions and have an explosion in our oil refinery in Texas, as BP had. Or Wells Fargo, let's fraud our own clients. Nobody does that. They all have nice, ethical systems, integrity systems, codes of conduct, training, value practices, etc. We have all of that too. The problem is when there's a disconnect between what the leadership at the top or the rules at the top are saying and the everyday practices. So imagine that you're a safety manager or engineer in Alaska around 2005-06, working for BP. On the one hand, the head office in London is saying safety is paramount. It's really important, and we don't want oil spills. On the other hand, they cut your budget across the board with 25%. You're asking them for another 100,000 investment to make sure your pipes are safe because of all kinds of oil leakage. And you need more engineers because all the top engineers have been fired. And by the way, the work you're doing is increasingly complex, so you need more engineers. Similar to what we have in the university. We have on the one hand these great looking policies, and there's more and more. The DORA Declaration, open access publishing. We need better teaching. We need the students to be activated, etc. All beautiful ideals. Then on the work floor, the everyday work is sort of everybody's half drowning. Everybody has to stay afloat some way or another. I mean, depends on the school, but the schools I've worked, it's been this case. And people around them see other people in certain contexts cutting corners. And they also see that this has become normalized. So at which point are you going to say, okay, what my leaders are saying is real. I really have to do that. Or at which point are you going to say, well, whatever they're saying, it just doesn't fit my reality. I'll go through the motions. I'll go through the training. I'll go through bystander training. I'll go through this and that, but I don't know how to use it in my everyday work. What that does is really, really harmful. It creates a sort of what I call corporate cognitive dissonance. And we can translate it to universities in organizational cognitive dissonance, where we have to preach values that don't meet actually what people do in everyday life or what they value. And what it does, it undermines the authority and the legitimacy of the internal rules and ethics. And it can create more rule breaking, as some of the research shows. And the hard thing here is any leadership that comes in and says, we're going to change things, they have to overcome years and years and years of this. And this is where a negative culture sets in most deeply. So let me get to my conclusion. So there can be this negative sort of circle where we have unrealistic expectations that create strain, that become deeper because there's no pushback against it, which creates more opportunity for people to offend, which then normalizes offending behavior. That then goes deeper because there's blame shifting once that happens. There's neutralization because we defend it and we don't talk about it openly, we don't learn from it. And finally, we don't trust our leaders to actually want to change things. Okay, this is the worst of the worst because I like studying really bad organizations. That doesn't mean that we're there. And the reason I present all this is to think about risk. And I mean, I'd rather not have a 10 past 12 conversation, which these companies have. I'd rather have a 5 past 11 conversation. We're not here. I don't think many universities are in the full, let's say, Volkswagen mode or Wells Fargo mode. I haven't seen any indication of that. But we are definitely at certain risks and there are certain things we can address. So let me get to the implications. This is more the general implications for what we can do. But let me get to the implications for academia, which I came up with today. So bear with me. I've not thought this out deeply enough, and I look forward. I have to go to a meeting at 4, but I'll be back at 6 to talk with all of you. First of all, look at the deeper underlying causes. Some of the things that are here have already been said in the introduction. So I said they're really well known. But I think the first is if any university administrator, and I've said the same to mine at the central level, wants to address integrity issues or social safety issues, the first conversation we need to have is about workload. If we're not addressing workload, we're not addressing this. This also becomes a political discussion. I think in national politics, there's many reasons to ask for more resources and not just temporary resources because they make things work. Worse, no structural resources because of the growth of the amount of students has not been matched, at least not in the Netherlands, by the amount of resources for staff. The first and foremost reason to ask for this is that we can't do integrity in academia if we have an unrealistic workload. I think whatever other things we're trying to do, it's sort of shifting deck chairs on the Titanic, as the Americans say. If people are sort of trying to keep their head afloat in their everyday work, you're always going to get these problems popping up. So first of all, it is about workload. Second, also it is about bottom line. I think universities have to be more realistic about ambition. We've all gone crazy by talking about excellence. I've never met somebody who's excellent. I've never done. I mean, not because I'm overly critical. I think we're human. So let's get rid of that word. Let's get rid of. I mean, the other thing is, a colleague of mine once said, 2 academics only agree on one thing, that the third academic is rubbish. I mean, it's those types of things that we're all so good at. That also, for me, after 21 years in academia, I'm getting tired of judging others, always measuring others against certain elements. And I see what that does in terms of how it affects integrity. Second, we have a problem because we cannot define quality in academic work. Look, I've tried for years in legal academia to come up with solutions to this. We can lower sort of quantitative standards. Everybody has done so. And then we make qualitative standards higher. What happens is then we say, well, it has to be certain journals. Then what happens is we're all in the same sort of docket for these journals. Again, that's not working. So we have a problem there, and I think we need to work much more on that. And it will stay. It's the same problem in many sorts of qualitative work like ours, where it's very hard to put any measure on quality in academic work. I do think we have to look at formal and social hierarchies. I think empowerment and reduction of hierarchies is really important. I think we've gone already in a certain direction. I do think what's happened in the US in this, where you sort of have a two-tier layer, where you have tenured versus non-tenured. Non-tenured, of course, is a very low hierarchy. And of course, you have staff, which is not even a hierarchy, which is treated way worse than in the Netherlands. But of academic personnel, the tier of tenured faculty is really big. And they really work in most faculties in a very democratic fashion. There's still problems there, but there's much less department heads or sub-department or sections or sort of these pyramids where there's only limited amounts of people that can go up. I do think we need to address this. Empowerment. I know it's an easy word to say. I can talk much more about it if you want. I've done studies on power differentials in organizations and how it affects speaking out. And there's a lot of work on this. Looking at taking organizational responsibility, that's clear. I already mentioned transparency. Look, I know this hurts because it does come at the cost of privacy. But I think it's a major trade-off that we need to look at. And finally, make sure that leadership actually follows through on what they say actually matches reality. So try and stay away of things that are too lofty. Okay, I'll stop there. So there maybe is some time for Q&A.